Chapter 20 of A Child's History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corrie Samuel. A Child's History of England by Charles Dickens. Chapter 20. England under Henry IV, called Bolingbroke. During the last reign, the preaching of Wycliffe against the pride and cunning of the Pope and all his men had made a great noise in England. Whether the new king wished to be in favour with the priests, or whether he hoped, by pretending to be very religious, to cheat heaven itself into the belief that he was not a usurper, I don't know. Both suppositions are likely enough. It is certain that he began his reign by making a strong show against the followers of Wycliffe, who were called Lollards or heretics, although his father, John of Gaunt, had been of that way of thinking, as he himself had been more than suspected of being. It is no less certain that he first established in England the detestable and atrocious custom, brought from abroad, of burning those people as a punishment for their opinions. It was the importation into England of one of the practices of what was called the Holy Inquisition, which was the most unholy and the most infamous tribunal that ever disgraced mankind, and made men more like demons than followers of our Saviour. No real right to the crown, as you know, was in this king. Edward Mortimer, the young Earl of March, who was only 8 or 9 years old, and who was descended from the Duke of Clarence, the elder brother of Henry's father, was, by succession, the real heir to the throne. However, the king got his son declared Prince of Wales, and, obtaining possession of the young Earl of March and his little brother, kept them in confinement, but not severely, in Windsor Castle. He then required the Parliament to decide what was to be done with the deposed king, who was quiet enough, and who only said that he hoped his cousin Henry would be a good lord to him. The Parliament replied that they would recommend his being kept in some secret place, where the people could not resort, and where his friends could not be admitted to see him. Henry accordingly passed this sentence upon him, and it now began to be pretty clear to the nation that Richard II would not live very long. It was a noisy Parliament, as it was an unprincipled one, and the Lords quarrelled so violently among themselves as to which of them had been loyal and which disloyal, and which consistent and which inconsistent, that 40 gauntlets are said to have been thrown upon the floor at one time as challenges to as many battles, the truth being that they were all false and base together, and had been at one time with the old king, and at another time with the new one, and seldom true for any length of time to any one. They soon began to plot again. A conspiracy was formed to invite the king to a tournament at Oxford, and then to take him by surprise and kill him. This murderous enterprise, which was agreed upon at secret meetings in the house of the Abbot of Westminster, was betrayed by the Earl of Rutland, one of the conspirators. The king, instead of going to the tournament or staying at Windsor, where the conspirators suddenly went on finding themselves discovered, with the hope of seizing him, retired to London, proclaimed them all traitors, and advanced upon them with a great force. They retired into the west of England, proclaiming Richard king, but the people rose against them, and they were all slain. Their treason hastened the end of the deposed monarch. Whether he was killed by hired assassins, or whether he was starved to death, or whether he refused food on hearing of his brothers being killed, who were in that plot, is very doubtful. He met his death somehow, and his body was publicly shown at St. Paul's Cathedral, with only the lower part of the face uncovered. I can scarcely doubt that he was killed by the king's orders. The French wife of the miserable Richard was now only 10 years old, and when her father, Charles of France, heard of her misfortunes, and of her lonely condition in England, he went mad, as he had several times done before during the last 5 or 6 years. The French Dukes of Burgundy and Bourbon took up the poor girl's cause, without caring much about it, but on the chance of getting something out of England. The people of Bordeaux, who had a sort of superstitious attachment to the memory of Richard because he was born there, swore by the Lord that he had been the best man in all his kingdom, which was going rather far, and promised to do great things against the English. Nevertheless, when they came to consider that they and the whole people of France were ruined by their own nobles, and that the English rule was much the better of the two, they cooled down again, and the two dukes, although they were very great men, could do nothing without them. Then began negotiations between France and England for the sending home to Paris of the poor little Queen, with all her jewels and her fortune of 200,000 francs in gold. The King was quite willing to restore the young lady, and even the jewels, but he said he really could not part with the money. So, at last, she was safely deposited at Paris without her fortune. And then the Duke of Burgundy, who was cousin to the French King, began to quarrel with the Duke of Orleans, who was brother to the French King, about the whole matter, and those two dukes made France even more wretched than ever. As the idea of conquering Scotland was still popular at home, the King marched to the river Tyne and demanded homage of the King of that country. This being refused, he advanced to Edinburgh, but did little there, for, his army being in want of provisions, and the Scotch being very careful to hold him in check without giving battle, he was obliged to retire. It is to his immortal honour that in this sally he burnt no villages and slaughtered no people, but was particularly careful that his army should be merciful and harmless. It was a great example in those ruthless times. A war among the border people of England and Scotland went on for 12 months, and then the Earl of Northumberland, the nobleman who had helped Henry to the crown, began to rebel against him, probably because nothing that Henry could do for him would satisfy his extravagant expectations. There was a certain Welsh gentleman, named Owen Glendower, who had been a student in one of the Inns of Court, and had afterwards been in the service of the late King, whose Welsh property was taken from him by a powerful lord related to the present King, who was his neighbour. Appealing for redress and getting none, he took up arms, was made an outlaw, and declared himself sovereign of Wales. He pretended to be a magician, and not only were the Welsh people stupid enough to believe him, but even Henry believed him too, for, making 3 expeditions into Wales, and being 3 times driven back by the wildness of the country, the bad weather, and the skill of Glendower, he thought he was defeated by the Welshman's magic arts. However, he took Lord Grey and Sir Edmund Mortimer prisoners, and allowed the relatives of Lord Grey to ransom him, but would not extend such favour to Sir Edmund Mortimer. Now, Henry Percy, called Hotspur, son of the Earl of Northumberland, who was married to Mortimer's sister, is supposed to have taken offence at this, and therefore, in conjunction with his father and some others, to have joined Owen Glendower, and risen against Henry. It is by no means clear that this was the real cause of the conspiracy, but perhaps it was made the pretext. It was formed, and was very powerful, including Scroop, Archbishop of York, and the Earl of Douglas, a powerful and brave Scottish nobleman. The King was prompt and active, and the 2 armies met at Shrewsbury. There were about 14,000 men in each. The old Earl of Northumberland being sick, the rebel forces were led by his son. The King wore plain armour to deceive the enemy, and 4 noblemen, with the same object, wore the royal arms. The rebel charge was so furious that every one of those gentlemen was killed, the royal standard was beaten down, and the young Prince of Wales was severely wounded in the face. But he was one of the bravest and best soldiers that ever lived, and he fought so well, and the King's troops were so encouraged by his bold example, that they rallied immediately, and cut the enemy's forces all to pieces, Hotspur was killed by an arrow in the brain, and the rout was so complete that the whole rebellion was struck down by this one blow. The Earl of Northumberland surrendered himself soon after hearing of the death of his son, and received a pardon for all his offences. There were some lingerings of rebellion yet, Owen Glendower being retired to Wales, and a preposterous story being spread among the ignorant people that King Richard was still alive. How they could have believed such nonsense it is difficult to imagine, but they certainly did suppose that the court fool of the late king, who was something like him, was he himself, so that it seemed as if, after giving so much trouble to the country in his life, he was still to trouble it after his death. This was not the worst. The young Earl of March and his brother were stolen out of Windsor Castle. Being retaken, and being found to have been spirited away by one Lady Spencer, she accused her own brother, that Earl of Rutland who was in the former conspiracy, and was now Duke of York, of being in the plot. For this he was ruined in fortune, though not put to death. And then another plot rose among the old Earl of Northumberland, some other lords, and that same Scroop, Archbishop of York, who was with the rebels before. These conspirators caused a writing to be posted on the church doors, accusing the king of a variety of crimes, but, the king being eager and vigilant to oppose them, they were all taken, and the archbishop was executed. This was the first time that a great churchman had been slain by the law in England, but the king was resolved that it should be done, and done it was. The next most remarkable event of this time was the seizure, by Henry, of the heir to the Scottish throne, James, a boy of 9 years old. He had been put aboard ship by his father, the Scottish King Robert, to save him from the designs of his uncle, when, on his way to France, he was accidentally taken by some English cruisers. He remained a prisoner in England for 19 years, and became in his prison a student and a famous poet. With the exception of occasional troubles with the Welsh and with the French, the rest of King Henry's reign was quiet enough. But the king was far from happy, and probably was troubled in his conscience by knowing that he had usurped the crown, and had occasioned the death of his miserable cousin. The Prince of Wales, though brave and generous, is said to have been wild and dissipated, and even to have drawn his sword on Gascoigne, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, because he was firm in dealing impartially with one of his dissolute companions. Upon this the Chief Justice is said to have ordered him immediately to prison. The Prince of Wales is said to have submitted with a good grace, and the King is said to have exclaimed, "Happy is the monarch who has so just a judge, and a son so willing to obey the laws." This is all very doubtful, and so is another story, of which Shakespeare has made beautiful use, that the Prince once took the crown out of his father's chamber as he was sleeping, and tried it on his own head. The King's health sank more and more, and he became subject to violent eruptions on the face, and to bad epileptic fits, and his spirits sank every day. At last, as he was praying before the shrine of St. Edward at Westminster Abbey, he was seized with a terrible fit, and was carried into the abbot's chamber, where he presently died. It had been foretold that he would die at Jerusalem, which certainly is not, and never was, Westminster. But, as the abbot's room had long been called the Jerusalem Chamber, people said it was all the same thing, and were quite satisfied with the prediction. The King died on the 20th of March, 1413, in the 47th year of his age, and the 14th of his reign. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral. He had been twice married, and had, by his first wife, a family of 4 sons and 2 daughters. Considering his duplicity before he came to the throne, his unjust seizure of it, and above all, his making that monstrous law for the burning of what the priests called heretics, he was a reasonably good king, as kings went. End of chapter 20.
Of a Child's History of England, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. A Child's History of England, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 21. England under Henry V. First Part. The Prince of Wales began his reign like a generous and honest man. He set the young Earl of March free. He restored their estates and their honours to the Percy family, who had lost them by the rebellion against his father. He ordered the imbecile and unfortunate Richard to be honourably buried among the kings of England, and he dismissed all his wild companions, with assurances that they should not want, if they would resolve to be steady, faithful, and true. It is much easier to burn men than to burn their opinions, and those of the Lollards were spreading every day. The Lollards were represented by the priests, probably falsely for the most part, to entertain treasonable designs against the new King, and Henry, suffering himself to be worked upon by these representations, sacrificed his friend Sir John Oldcastle, the Lord Cobham, to them, after trying in vain to convert him by arguments. He was declared guilty, as the head of the sect, and sentenced to the flames. But he escaped from the Tower before the day of execution, postponed for 50 days by the King himself, and summoned the Lollards to meet him near London on a certain day. So the priests told the King, at least. I doubt whether there was any conspiracy beyond such as was got up by their agents. On the day appointed, instead of 25,000 men, under the command of Sir John Oldcastle, in the meadows of St. Giles the King found only 80 men, and no Sir John at all. There was, in another place, an addle-headed brewer who had gold trappings to his horses and a pair of gilt spurs in his breast, expecting to be made a knight next day by Sir John, and so to gain the right to wear them. But there was no Sir John, nor did anybody give information respecting him, though the King offered great rewards for such intelligence. 30 of these unfortunate Lollards were hanged and drawn immediately, and were then burnt, gallows and all. And the various prisons in and around London were crammed full of others. Some of these unfortunate men made various confessions of treasonable designs, but such confessions were easily got, under torture and the fear of fire, and are very little to be trusted. To finish the sad story of Sir John Oldcastle at once, I may mention that he escaped into Wales, and remained there safely for 4 years. When discovered by Lord Powis, it is very doubtful if he would have been taken alive, so great was the old soldier's bravery, if a miserable old woman had not come behind him and broken his legs with a stool. He was carried to London in a horse-litter, was fastened by an iron chain to a gibbet, and so roasted to death. To make the state of France as plain as I can in a few words, I should tell you that the Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Burgundy, commonly called John without Fear, had had a grand reconciliation of their quarrel in the last reign, and had appeared to be quite in a heavenly state of mind. Immediately after which, on a Sunday, in the public streets of Paris, the Duke of Orleans was murdered by a party of 20 men, set on by the Duke of Burgundy, according to his own deliberate confession. The widow of King Richard had been married in France to the eldest son of the Duke of Orleans. The poor mad King was quite powerless to help her, and the Duke of Burgundy became the real master of France. Isabella dying, her husband, a Duke of Orleans since the death of his father, married the daughter of the Count of Armagnac, who, being a much abler man than his young son-in-law, headed his party, thence called after him Armagnacs. Thus France was now in this terrible condition, that it had in it the party of the King's son, the Dauphin Louis, the party of the Duke of Burgundy, who was the father of the Dauphin's ill-used wife, and the party of the Armagnacs, all hating each other, all fighting together, all composed of the most depraved nobles that the earth has ever known, and all tearing unhappy France to pieces. The late King had watched these dissensions from England, sensible, like the French people, that no enemy of France could injure her more than her own nobility. The present King now advanced a claim to the French throne. His demand being, of course, refused, he reduced his proposal to a certain large amount of French territory, and to demanding the French Princess Catherine in marriage with a fortune of 2 millions of golden crowns. He was offered less territory and fewer crowns, and no princess, but he called his ambassadors home and prepared for war. Then he proposed to take the Princess with 1 million of crowns. The French court replied that he should have the Princess with 200,000 crowns less. He said this would not do (he had never seen the Princess in his life), and assembled his army at Southampton. There was a short plot at home just at that time for deposing him and making the Earl of March King; but the conspirators were all speedily condemned and executed, and the King embarked for France. It is dreadful to observe how long a bad example will be followed, but it is encouraging to know that a good example is never thrown away. The King's first act on disembarking at the mouth of the river Seine, 3 miles from Harfleur, was to imitate his father, and to proclaim his solemn orders that the lives and property of the peaceable inhabitants should be respected on pain of death. It is agreed by French writers, to his lasting renown, that even while his soldiers were suffering the greatest distress from want of food, these commands were rigidly obeyed. With an army in all of 30,000 men, he besieged the town of Harfleur both by sea and land for 5 weeks, at the end of which time the town surrendered, and the inhabitants were allowed to depart with only 5 pence each, and a part of their clothes. All the rest of their possessions was divided amongst the English army. But that army suffered so much, in spite of its successes, from disease and privation, that it was already reduced 1/2. Still, the King was determined not to retire until he had struck a greater blow. Therefore, against the advice of all his counsellors, he moved on with his little force toward Calais. When he came to the river Somme, he was unable to cross, in consequence of the fort being fortified, and as the English moved up the left bank of the river looking for a crossing, the French, who had broken all the bridges, moved up the right bank, watching them, and waiting to attack them when they should try to pass it. At last the English found a crossing, and got safely over. The French held a council of war at Rouen, resolved to give the English battle, and sent heralds to King Henry, to know by which road he was going. "By the road that will take me straight to Calais," said the King, and sent them away with a present of 100 crowns. The English moved on, until they beheld the French, and then the King gave orders to form in line of battle. The French not coming on, the army broke up after remaining in battle array till night, and got good rest and refreshment at the neighbouring village. The French were now all lying in another village, through which they knew the English must pass. They were resolved that the English should begin the battle. The English had no means of retreat, if their King had any such intention, and so the two armies passed the night close together. To understand these armies well, you must bear in mind that the immense French army had, among its notable persons, almost the whole of that wicked nobility, whose debauchery had made France a desert, and so besotted were they by pride and by contempt for the common people, that they had scarcely any bowmen, if indeed they had any at all, in their whole enormous number, which, compared with the English army, was at least as 6 to 1. For these proud fools had said that the bow was not a fit weapon for knightly hands, and that France must be defended by gentlemen only. We shall see, presently, what hand the gentlemen made of it. Now, on the English side, among the little force, there was a good proportion of men who were not gentlemen by any means, but who were good stout archers for all that. Among them, in the morning, having slept little at night, while the French were carousing and making sure of victory, the King rode on a grey horse, wearing on his head a helmet of shining steel, surmounted by a crown of gold, sparkling with precious stones, and bearing over his armour, embroidered together, the arms of England and the arms of France. The archers looked at the shining helmet and the crown of gold and the sparkling jewels, and admired them all. But what they admired most was the King's cheerful face, and his bright blue eye, as he told them that, for himself, he had made up his mind to conquer there or to die there, and that England should never have a ransom to pay for him. There was one brave knight who chanced to say that he wished some of the many gallant gentlemen and good soldiers who were then idle at home in England were there to increase their numbers. But the King told him that, for his part, he did not wish for one more man. "The fewer we have," said he, "the greater will be the honour we shall win." His men, being now all in good heart, were refreshed with bread and wine, and heard prayers, and waited quietly for the French. The King waited for the French, because they were drawn up 30 deep (the little English force was only 3 deep), on very difficult and heavy ground, and he knew that when they moved, there must be confusion among them. As they did not move, he sent off 2 parties, one to lie concealed in a wood on the left of the French, the other to set fire to some houses behind the French after the battle should be begun. This was scarcely done, when 3 of the proud French gentlemen, who were to defend their country without any help from the base peasants, came riding out, calling upon the English to surrender. The King warned those gentlemen himself to retire with all speed if they cared for their lives, and ordered the English banners to advance. Upon that, Sir Thomas Erpingham, a great English general, who commanded the archers, threw his truncheon into the air, joyfully, and all the Englishmen, kneeling down upon the ground and biting it as if they took possession of the country, rose up with a great shout, and fell upon the French. Every archer was furnished with a great stake tipped with iron, and his orders were to thrust this stake into the ground, to discharge his arrow, and then to fall back, when the French horsemen came on. As the haughty French gentlemen, who were to break the English archers and utterly destroy them with their knightly lances, came riding up, they were received with such a blinding storm of arrows that they broke and turned. Horses and men rolled over one another, and the confusion was terrific. Those who rallied and charged the archers got among the stakes on slippery and boggy ground, and were so bewildered that the English archers, who wore no armour, and even took off their leathern coats to be more active, cut them to pieces, root and branch. Only 3 French horsemen got within the stakes, and those were instantly despatched. All this time, the dense French army, being in armour, were sinking knee-deep into the mire, while the light English archers, half naked, were as fresh and active as if they were fighting on a marble floor. But now, the second division of the French, coming to the relief of the first, closed up in a firm mass. The English, headed by the King, attacked them, and the deadliest part of the battle began. The King's brother, the Duke of Clarence, was struck down, and numbers of the French surrounded him; but King Henry, standing over the body, fought like a lion until they were beaten off. Presently came up a band of 18 French knights, bearing the banner of a certain French lord who had sworn to kill or take the English King. One of them struck him such a blow with a battle-axe that he reeled and fell upon his knees; but his faithful men, immediately closing around him, killed every one of those 18 knights, and so that French lord never kept his oath. The French Duke of Alençon, seeing this, made a desperate charge and cut his way close up to the royal standard of England. He beat down the Duke of York, who was standing near it, and when the King came to his rescue, struck off a piece of the crown he wore. But he never struck another blow in this world, for even as he was in the act of saying who he was, and that he surrendered to the King, and even as the King stretched out his hand to give him a safe and honourable acceptance of the offer, he fell dead, pierced by innumerable wounds. The death of this nobleman decided the battle. The third division of the French army, which had never struck a blow yet, and which was in itself more than double the whole English power, broke and fled. At this time of the flight, the English, who as yet had made no prisoners, began to take them in immense numbers, and were still occupied in doing so, or in killing those who would not surrender, when a great noise arose in the rear of the French. Their flying banners were seen to stop, and King Henry, supposing a great reinforcement to have arrived, gave orders that all the prisoners should be put to death. As soon, however, as it was found that the noise was only occasioned by a body of plundering peasants, the terrible massacre was stopped. Then King Henry called to him the French herald, and asked him to whom the victory belonged. The herald replied, "To the King of England." "We have not made this havoc and slaughter," said the King. "It is the wrath of Heaven on the sins of France. What is the name of that castle yonder?" The herald answered him, "My lord, it is the Castle Azincourt." Said the King, "From henceforth this battle shall be known to posterity by the name of the Battle of Azincourt." Now, our English historians have made it Agincourt, but under that name it will ever be famous in English annals. The loss upon the French side was enormous. 3 dukes were killed, 2 more were taken prisoners, 7 counts were killed, 3 more were taken prisoners, and 10,000 knights and gentlemen were slain upon the field. The English loss amounted to 1,600 men, among whom were the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk. War is a dreadful thing, and it is appalling to know how the English were obliged, next morning, to kill those prisoners mortally wounded, who yet writhed in agony upon the ground; how the dead upon the French side were stripped by their own countrymen and countrywomen, and afterwards buried in great pits; how the dead upon the English side were piled up in a great barn, and how their bodies and the barn were all burned together. It is in such things, and in many more much too horrible to relate, that the real desolation and wickedness of war consist. Nothing can make war otherwise than horrible. But the dark side of it was little thought of, and soon forgotten, and it cast no shade of trouble on the English people, except on those who had lost friends or relations in the fight. They welcomed their King home with shouts of rejoicing, and plunged into the water to bear him ashore on their shoulders, and flocked out in crowds to welcome him, in every town through which he passed, and hung rich carpets and tapestries out of the windows, and strewed the streets with flowers, and made the fountains run with wine, as the great field of Agincourt had run with blood. Second Part. That proud and wicked French nobility who dragged their country to destruction, and who were every day and every year regarded with deeper hatred and detestation in the hearts of the French people, learnt nothing, even from the defeat of Agincourt. So far from uniting against the common enemy, they became, among themselves, more violent, more bloody, and more false, if that were possible, than they had been before. The Count of Armagnac persuaded the French King to plunder of her treasures Queen Isabella of Bavaria, and to make her a prisoner. She, who had hitherto been the bitter enemy of the Duke of Burgundy, proposed to join him in revenge. He carried her off to Troyes, where she proclaimed herself Regent of France, and made him her lieutenant. The Armagnac party were at that time possessed of Paris, but one of the gates of the city being secretly opened on a certain night to a party of the Duke's men, they got into Paris, threw into the prisons all the Armagnacs upon whom they could lay their hands, and a few nights afterwards, with the aid of a furious mob of 60,000 people, broke the prisons open and killed them all. The former Dauphin was now dead, and the King's third son bore the title. Him, in the height of this murderous scene, a French knight hurried out of bed, wrapped him in a sheet, and bore away to Poitiers. So, when the revengeful Isabella and the Duke of Burgundy entered Paris in triumph after the slaughter of their enemies, the Dauphin was proclaimed at Poitiers as the real Regent. King Henry had not been idle since his victory of Agincourt, but had repulsed a brave attempt of the French to recover Harfleur, had gradually conquered a great part of Normandy, and at this crisis of affairs took the important town of Rouen, after a siege of half a year. This great loss so alarmed the French, that the Duke of Burgundy proposed that a meeting to treat of peace should be held between the French and the English kings in a plain by the river Seine. On the appointed day, King Henry appeared there, with his two brothers, Clarence and Gloucester, and 1,000 men. The unfortunate French King, being more mad than usual that day, could not come; but the Queen came, and with her the Princess Catherine, who was a very lovely creature, and who made a real impression on King Henry, now that he saw her for the first time. This was the most important circumstance that arose out of the meeting. As if it were impossible for a French nobleman of that time to be true to his word of honour in anything, Henry discovered that the Duke of Burgundy was, at that very moment, in secret treaty with the Dauphin, and he therefore abandoned the negotiation. The Duke of Burgundy and the Dauphin, each of whom with the best reason distrusted the other as a noble ruffian surrounded by a party of noble ruffians, were rather at a loss how to proceed after this. But at length they agreed to meet, on a bridge over the river Yonne, where it was arranged that there should be 2 strong gates put up, with an empty space between them, and that the Duke of Burgundy should come into that space by one gate, with 10 men only, and that the Dauphin should come into that space by the other gate, also with 10 men, and no more. So far the Dauphin kept his word, but no farther. When the Duke of Burgundy was on his knee before him in the act of speaking, one of the Dauphin's noble ruffians cut the said Duke down with a small axe, and the others speedily finished him. It was in vain for the Dauphin to pretend that this base murder was not done with his consent. It was too bad, even for France, and caused a general horror. The Duke's heir hastened to make a treaty with King Henry, and the French Queen engaged that her husband should consent to it, whatever it was. Henry made peace, on condition of receiving the Princess Catherine in marriage, and being made Regent of France during the rest of the King's lifetime, and succeeding to the French crown at his death. He was soon married to the beautiful Princess, and took her proudly home to England, where she was crowned with great honour and glory. This peace was called the Perpetual Peace. We shall soon see how long it lasted. It gave great satisfaction to the French people, although they were so poor and miserable that, at the time of the celebration of the royal marriage, numbers of them were dying with starvation, on the dunghills in the streets of Paris. There was some resistance on the part of the Dauphin in some parts of France, but King Henry beat it all down. And now, with his great possessions in France secured, and his beautiful wife to cheer him, and a son born to give him greater happiness, all appeared bright before him. But, in the fulness of his triumph and the height of his power, death came upon him, and his day was done. When he fell ill at Vincennes, and found that he could not recover, he was very calm and quiet, and spoke serenely to those who wept around his bed. His wife and child, he said, he left to the loving care of his brother the Duke of Bedford, and his other faithful nobles. He gave them his advice that England should establish a friendship with the new Duke of Burgundy, and offer him the regency of France; that it should not set free the royal princes who had been taken at Agincourt; and that, whatever quarrel might arise with France, England should never make peace without holding Normandy. Then he laid down his head, and asked the attendant priest to chant the penitential psalms. Amid with solemn sounds, on the 31st of August, 1422, in only the 34th year of his age and the 10th of his reign, King Henry the Fifth passed away. Slowly and mournfully they carried his embalmed body in a procession of great state to Paris, and thence to Rouen, where his Queen was, from whom the sad intelligence of his death was concealed until he had been dead some days. Thence, lying on a bed of crimson and gold, with a golden crown upon the head, and a golden ball and sceptre lying in the nerveless hands, they carried it to Calais, with such a great retinue as seemed to dye the road black. The King of Scotland acted as chief mourner. All the royal household followed. The knights wore black armour and black plumes of feathers, crowds of men bore torches, making the night as light as day, and the widowed princess followed, last of all. At Calais there was a fleet of ships to bring the funeral host to Dover, And so, by way of London Bridge, where the service for the dead was chanted as it passed along, they brought the body to Westminster Abbey, and there buried it with great respect. Chapter 21. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois. Of a Child's History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. A Child's History of England, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 22. England under Henry VI. Part the First. It had been the wish of the late King that while his infant son, King Henry VI., at this time only 9 months old, was under age, the Duke of Gloucester should be appointed Regent. The English Parliament, however, preferred to appoint a Council of Regency, with the Duke of Bedford at its head, to be represented, in his absence only, by the Duke of Gloucester. The Parliament would seem to have been wise in this, for Gloucester soon showed himself to be ambitious and troublesome, and in the gratification of his own personal schemes gave dangerous offence to the Duke of Burgundy, which was with difficulty adjusted. As that Duke declined the Regency of France, it was bestowed by the poor French King upon the Duke of Bedford. But the French King dying within 2 months, the Dauphin instantly asserted his claim to the French throne, and was actually crowned under the title of Charles VII. The Duke of Bedford, to be a match for him, entered into a friendly league with the Dukes of Burgundy and Brittany, and gave them his 2 sisters in marriage. War with France was immediately renewed, and the perpetual peace came to an untimely end. In the first campaign, the English, aided by this alliance, were speedily successful. As Scotland, however, had sent the French 5,000 men, and might send more, or attack the north of England while England was busy with France, it was considered that it would be a good thing to offer the Scottish King, James, who had been so long imprisoned, his liberty, on his paying £40,000 for his board and lodging during 19 years, and engaging to forbid his subjects from serving under the flag of France. It is pleasant to know, not only that the amiable captive at last regained his freedom upon these terms, but that he married a noble English lady with whom he had been long in love, and became an excellent king. I am afraid we have met with some kings in this history, and shall meet with some more, who would have been very much the better, and would have left the world much happier, if they had been imprisoned 19 years too. In the second campaign, the English gained a considerable victory at Verneuil, in a battle which was chiefly remarkable otherwise for the resorting to the odd expedient of tying their baggage horses together by the heads and tails, and jumbling them up with the baggage, so as to convert them into a sort of live fortification, which was found useful to the troops, but which I should think was not agreeable to the horses. For 3 years afterwards very little was done, owing to both sides being too poor for war, which is a very expensive entertainment. But a council was then held in Paris, in which it was decided to lay siege to the town of Orleans, which was a place of great importance to the Dauphin's cause. An English army of 10,000 men was despatched on this service, under the command of the Earl of Salisbury, a general of fame. He being unfortunately killed early in the siege, the Earl of Suffolk took his place, under whom, reinforced by Sir John Falstaff, who brought up 400 waggons laden with salt herrings and other provisions for the troops, and beating off the French who tried to intercept him, came victorious out of a hot skirmish, which was afterwards called, in jest, the Battle of the Herrings. The town of Orleans was so completely hemmed in, that the besieged proposed to yield it up to their countryman, the Duke of Burgundy. The English general, however, replied that his Englishmen had won it, so far, by their blood and valour, and that his English men must have it. there seemed to be no hope for the town, or for the Dauphin, who was so dismayed that he even thought of flying to Scotland or to Spain, when a peasant girl rose up and changed the whole state of affairs. The story of this peasant girl I have now to tell. Part the Second. The Story of Joan of Arc. In a remote village among some wild hills in the province of Lorraine, there lived a countryman whose name was Jacques d'Arc. He had a daughter, Joan of Arc, who was at this time in her 20th year. She had been a solitary girl from her childhood. She had often tended sheep and cattle for whole days where no human figure was seen or human voice heard, and she had often knelt, for hours together, in the gloomy, empty little village chapel, looking up at the altar and at the dim lamp burning before it, until she fancied that she saw shadowy figures standing there, and even that she heard them speak to her. The people in that part of France were very ignorant and superstitious, and they had many ghostly tales to tell about what they had dreamed, and what they saw among the lonely hills when the clouds and the mists were resting on them. So, they easily believed that Joan saw strange sights, and they whispered among themselves that angels and spirits talked to her. At last Joan told her father that she had one day been surprised by a great unearthly light, and had afterwards heard a solemn voice, which said it was St. Michael's voice, telling her that she was to go and help the Dauphin. Soon after this, she said, St. Catherine and St. Margaret had appeared to her with sparkling crowns upon their heads, and had encouraged her to be virtuous and resolute. These visions had returned sometimes, but the voices very often, and the voices always said, "Joan, thou art appointed by Heaven to go and help the Dauphin." She almost always heard them while the chapel bells were ringing. Now, there is no doubt now that Joan believed she saw and heard these things. It is very well known that such delusions are a disease which is not by any means uncommon. It is probable enough that there were figures of St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret in the little chapel, where they would be very likely to have shining crowns upon their heads, and that they first gave Joan the idea of these three personages. She had long been a moping, fanciful girl, and though she was a very good girl, I dare say she was a little vain, and wishful for notoriety. Her father, something wiser than his neighbours, said, "I tell thee, Joan, it is thy fancy, and thou hadst better have a kind husband to take care of thee, girl, and work to employ thy mind." But Joan told him in reply that she had taken a vow never to have a husband, and that she must go, as Heaven directed her, to help the Dauphin. It happened, unfortunately for her father's persuasions, and most unfortunately for the poor girl too, that a party of the Dauphin's enemies found their way into the village while Joan's disorder was at this point, and burnt the chapel, and drove out the inhabitants. The cruelties she saw committed, touched Joan's heart and made her worse. She said that the voices and the figures were now continually with her, that they told her she was the girl who, according to an old prophecy, was to deliver France, and she must go and help the Dauphin, and must remain with him until he should be crowned at Rheims, and that she must travel a long way to a certain lord named Baudricourt, who could and would bring her into the Dauphin's presence. As her father still said, "I tell thee, Joan, it is thy fancy," she set off to find out this lord, accompanied by an uncle, a poor village wheelwright and cartmaker, who believed in the reality of her visions. They travelled a long way, and went on, over a rough country, full of the Duke of Burgundy's men, and of all kinds of robbers and marauders, until they came to where this lord was. When his servants told him that there was a poor peasant girl named Joan of Arc, accompanied by nobody but an old village wheelwright and cartmaker, who wished to see him because she was commanded to help the Dauphin and save France, Baudricourt burst out a-laughing, and bade them send the girl away. But he soon heard so much about her lingering in the town, and praying in the churches, and seeing visions, and doing harm to no one, that he sent for her, and questioned her. As she said the same things after she had been well sprinkled with holy water as she had said before the sprinkling, Baudricourt began to think there might be something in it. At all events he thought it worth while to send her on to the town of Chinon, where the Dauphin was. So, he bought her a horse, and a sword, and gave her 2 squires to conduct her. As the Voices had told Joan that she was to wear a man's dress, now she put one on, and girded her sword to her side, and bound spurs to her heels, and mounted her horse, and rode away with her 2 squires. As to her uncle the wheelwright, he stood staring at his niece in wonder until she was out of sight, as well he might, and then went home again. The best place, too. Joan and her 2 squires rode on and on, until they came to Chinon, where she was, after some doubt, admitted into the Dauphin's presence. Picking him out immediately from all his court, she told him that she came commanded by Heaven to subdue his enemies and conduct him to his coronation at Rheims. She also told him, or he pretended so afterwards, to make the greater impression upon his soldiers, a number of his secrets known only to himself; and furthermore, she said there was an old sword in the Cathedral of Saint Catherine at Fierbois, marked with 5 old crosses on the blade, which Saint Catherine had ordered her to wear. Now, nobody knew anything about this old sword, but when the Cathedral came to be examined, which was immediately done, there, sure enough, the sword was found. The Dauphin then required a number of grave priests and bishops to give him their opinion whether the girl derived her power from good spirits or from evil spirits, which they held prodigiously long debates about, in the course of which several learned men fell fast asleep and snored loudly. At last, when one gruff old gentleman had said to Joan, "What language do your Voices speak?" and when Joan had replied to the gruff old gentleman, "A pleasanter language than yours," they agreed that it was all correct, and that Joan of Arc was inspired from Heaven. This wonderful circumstance put new heart into the Dauphin's soldiers when they heard of it, and dispirited the English army, who took Joan for a witch. So, Joan mounted horse again, and again rode on and on until she came to Orleans; but she rode now as never peasant girl had ridden yet. She rode upon a white war horse, in a suit of glittering armour, with the old sword from the Cathedral, newly burnished, in her belt, with a white flag carried before her, upon which were a picture of God, and the words Jesus Maria. In this splendid state, at the head of a great body of troops, escorting provisions of all kinds for the starving inhabitants of Orleans, she appeared before that beleaguered city. When the people on the walls beheld her, they cried out, "The Maid is come! The Maid of the Prophecy is come to deliver us!" And this, and the sight of the Maid fighting at the head of their men, made the French so bold, and made the English so fearful, that the English line of forts was soon broken, the troops and provisions were got into the town, and Orleans was saved. Joan, henceforth called the Maid of Orleans, remained within the walls for a few days, and caused letters to be thrown over, ordering Lord Suffolk and his Englishmen to depart from before the town according to the will of Heaven. As the English general very positively declined to believe that Joan knew anything about the will of Heaven, which did not mend the matter with his soldiers, for they stupidly said if she were not inspired, she was a witch, and it was of no use to fight against a witch, she mounted her white war horse again, and ordered her white banner to advance. The besiegers held the bridge, and some strong towers upon the bridge, and here the Maid of Orleans attacked them. The fight was 14 hours long. She planted a scaling ladder with her own hands, and mounted a tower wall, but was struck by an English arrow in the neck, and fell into the trench. She was carried away, and the arrow was taken out, during which operation she screamed and cried with the pain, as any other girl might have done, but presently she said that the Voices were speaking to her, and soothing her to rest. After a while, she got up, and was again foremost in the fight. When the English, who had seen her fall and supposed her dead, saw this, they were troubled with the strangest fears, and some of them cried out that they beheld Saint Michael on a white horse (probably Joan herself) fighting for the French. They lost the bridge, and lost the towers, and next day set their chain of forts on fire, and left the place. But as Lord Suffolk himself retired no farther than the town of Jargeau, which was only a few miles off, the Maid of Orleans besieged him there, and he was taken prisoner. As the white banner scaled the wall, she was struck upon the head with a stone, and was again tumbled down into the ditch. But she only cried all the more as she lay there, "On, on, my countrymen, and fear nothing, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hands." After this new success of the Maid's, several other fortresses and places, which had previously held out against the Dauphin, were delivered up without a battle; and at Patay she defeated the remainder of the English army, and set up her victorious white banner on a field where 1,200 Englishmen lay dead. She now urged the Dauphin, who always kept out of the way when there was any fighting, to proceed to Rheims, as the first part of her mission was accomplished, and to complete the whole by being crowned there. The Dauphin was in no particular hurry to do this, as Rheims was a long way off, and the English and the Duke of Burgundy were still strong in the country through which the road lay. However, they set forth, with 10,000 men, and again the Maid of Orleans rode on and on, upon her white war horse, and in her shining armour. Whenever they came to a town which yielded readily, the soldiers believed in her; but, whenever they came to a town which gave them any trouble, they began to murmur that she was an impostor. The latter was particularly the case at Troyes, which finally yielded, however, through the persuasion of one Richard, a friar of the place. Friar Richard was in the old doubt about the Maid of Orleans, until he had sprinkled her well with holy water, and had also well sprinkled the threshold of the gate by which she came into the city. Finding that it made no change in her or the gate, he said, as the other grave old gentleman had said, that it was all right, and became her great ally. So, at last, by dint of riding on and on, the Maid of Orleans, and the Dauphin, and the 10,000 sometimes believing and sometimes unbelieving men, came to Rheims; and in the great Cathedral of Rheims the Dauphin actually was crowned Charles the Seventh in a great assembly of the people. Then, the Maid, who with her white banner stood beside the King in that hour of his triumph, kneeled down upon the pavement at his feet, and said, with tears, that what she had been inspired to do was done, and that the only recompense she asked for was, that she should now have leave to go back to her distant home, and her sturdily incredulous father, and her first simple escort the village wheelwright and cartmaker. But the King said, No, and made her and her family as noble as a king could, and settled upon her the income of a count. Ah! Happy had it been for the Maid of Orleans if she had resumed her rustic dress that day, and had gone home to the little chapel and the wild hills, and had forgotten all these things, and had been a good man's wife, and had heard no stranger voices than the voices of little children. It was not to be, and she continued helping the King (she did a world for him, in alliance with Friar Richard), and trying to improve the lives of the coarse soldiers, and leading a religious, unselfish, and a modest life, herself, beyond any doubt. Still, many times she prayed the King to let her go home, and once she even took off her bright armour and hung it up in a church, meaning never to wear it more. But, the King always won her back again, while she was of any use to him, and so she went on and on and on, to her doom. When the Duke of Bedford, who was a very able man, began to be active for England, and, by bringing the war back into France, and by holding the Duke of Burgundy to his faith, to distress and disturb Charles very much, Charles sometimes asked the Maid of Orleans what the voices said about it. But the voices had become, very like ordinary voices in perplexed times, contradictory and confused; so that now they said one thing, and now said another, and the Maid lost credit every day. Charles marched on Paris, which was opposed to him, and attacked the suburb of St. Honoré. In this fight, being again struck down into the ditch, she was abandoned by the whole army. She lay unaided among a heap of dead, and crawled out how she could. Then, some of her believers went over to an opposition maid, Catherine of La Rochelle, who said she was inspired to tell where there were treasures of buried money, though she never did, and then Joan accidentally broke the old sword, and others said that her power was broken with it. Finally, at the siege of Compiègne, held by the Duke of Burgundy, where she did valiant service, she was basely left alone in a retreat, though facing about and fighting to the last, and an archer pulled her off her horse. Oh, the uproar that was made, and the thanksgivings that were sung, about the capture of this one poor country girl! Oh, the way in which she was demanded to be tried for sorcery and heresy and anything else you like, by the Inquisitor General of France, and by this great man, and by that great man, until it is wearisome to think of! She was bought at last by the Bishop of Beauvais for 10,000 francs, and was shut up in her narrow prison. Plain Joan of Arc again, and Maid of Orleans no more. I should never have done if I were to tell you how they had Joan out to examine her, and cross-examine her, and re-examine her, and worry her into saying anything and everything, and how all sorts of scholars and doctors bestowed their utmost tediousness upon her. 16 times she was brought out and shut up again, and worried, and entrapped, and argued with, until she was heartsick of the dreary business. On the last occasion of this kind she was brought into a burial place at Rouen, dismally decorated with a scaffold, and a stake and faggots, and the executioner, and a pulpit with a friar therein, and an awful sermon ready. It is very affecting to know that even at that pass the poor girl honoured the mean vermin of a king, who had so used her for his purposes, and so abandoned her, and that while she had been regardless of reproaches heaped upon herself, she spoke out courageously for him. It was natural in one so young to hold to life. To save her life she signed a declaration prepared for her, signed it with a cross, for she couldn't write, that all her visions and voices had come from the devil. Upon her recanting the past, and protesting that she would never wear a man's dress in future, she was condemned to imprisonment for life, on the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. But, on the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction, the visions and the voices soon returned. It was quite natural that they should do so, for that kind of disease is much aggravated by fasting, loneliness, and anxiety of mind. It was not only got out of Joan that she considered herself inspired again, but she was taken in a man's dress, which had been left, to entrap her, in her prison, and which she put on, in her solitude. Perhaps in remembrance of her past glories, perhaps because the imaginary voices told her. For this relapse into the sorcery and heresy and anything else you like, she was sentenced to be burnt to death. And, in the market-place of Rouen, in the hideous dress which the monks had invented for such spectacles, with priests and bishops sitting in a gallery looking on, though some had the Christian grace to go away, unable to endure the infamous scene, this shrieking girl, last seen amidst the smoke and fire, holding a crucifix between her hands, last heard, calling upon Christ, was burnt to ashes. They threw her ashes into the river Seine, but they will rise against her murderers on the last day. From the moment of her capture, neither the French King nor one single man in all his court raised a finger to save her. It is no defence of them that they may have never really believed in her, or that they may have won her victories by their skill and bravery. The more they pretended to believe in her, the more they had caused her to believe in herself, and she had ever been true to them, ever brave, ever nobly devoted. But it is no wonder that they, who were in all things false to themselves, false to one another, false to their country, false to heaven, false to earth, should be monsters of ingratitude and treachery to a helpless peasant girl. In the picturesque old town of Rouen, where weeds and grass grow high on the cathedral towers,
and the venerable Norman streets are still warm in the blessed sunlight, though the monkish fires that once gleamed horribly upon them have long grown cold. There is a statue of Joan of Arc, in the scene of her last agony, the square to which she has given its present name. I know some statues of modern times, even in the world's metropolis, I think, which commemorate less constancy, less earnestness, smaller claims upon the world's attention, and much greater impostors. Part the Third. Bad deeds seldom prosper, happily for mankind, and the English cause gained no advantage from the cruel death of Joan of Arc. For a long time the war went heavily on. The Duke of Bedford died, the alliance with the Duke of Burgundy was broken, the Lord Talbot became a great general on the English side in France. But two of the consequences of war are, famine, because the people cannot peacefully cultivate the ground, and pestilence, which comes of want, misery, and suffering. Both these horrors broke out in both countries, and lasted for 2 wretched years. Then the war went on again, and came by slow degrees to be so badly conducted by the English government that, within 20 years from the execution of the Maid of Orleans, of all the great French conquests, the town of Calais alone remained in English hands. While these victories and defeats were taking place in the course of time, many strange things happened at home. The young King, as he grew up, proved to be very unlike his great father, and showed himself a miserable, puny creature. There was no harm in him; he had a great aversion to shedding blood, which was something, but he was a weak, silly, helpless young man, and a mere shuttlecock to the great lordly battledores about the court. Of these battledores, Cardinal Beaufort, a relation of the King, and the Duke of Gloucester were at first the most powerful. The Duke of Gloucester had a wife, who was nonsensically accused of practising witchcraft to cause the King's death and lead to her husband's coming to the throne, he being the next heir. She was charged with having, by the help of a ridiculous old woman named Margery, who was called a witch, made a little waxen doll, in the King's likeness, and put it before a slow fire that it might gradually melt away. It was supposed, in such cases, that the death of the person whom the doll was made to represent, was sure to happen. Whether the Duchess was as ignorant as the rest of them, and really did make such a doll with such an intention, I don't know; but you and I know very well that she might have made 1,000 dolls, if she had been stupid enough, and might have melted them all, without hurting the King or anybody else. However, she was tried for it, and so was old Margery, and so was one of the Duke's chaplains, who was charged with having assisted them. Both he and Margery were put to death, and the Duchess, after being taken on foot and bearing a lighted candle 3 times round the city, as a penance, was imprisoned for life. The Duke, himself, took all this pretty quietly, and made as little stir about the matter as if he were rather glad to be rid of the Duchess. But he was not destined to keep himself out of trouble long. The royal shuttlecock being 23, the battledores were very anxious to get him married. The Duke of Gloucester wanted him to marry a daughter of the Count of Armagnac, but the Cardinal and the Earl of Suffolk were all for Margaret, the daughter of the King of Sicily, who they knew was a resolute, ambitious woman, and would govern the King as she chose. To make friends with this lady, the Earl of Suffolk, who went over to arrange the match, consented to accept her for the King's wife without any fortune, and even to give up the 2 most valuable possessions England then had in France. So, the marriage was arranged on terms very advantageous to the lady, and Lord Suffolk brought her to England, and she was married at Westminster. On what pretence this Queen and her party charged the Duke of Gloucester with high treason within a couple of years, it is impossible to make out, the matter is so confused; but they pretended that the King's life was in danger, and they took the Duke prisoner. A fortnight afterwards, he was found dead in bed, they said, and his body was shown to the people, and Lord Suffolk came in for the best part of his estates. You know by this time how strangely liable state prisoners were to sudden death. If Cardinal Beaufort had any hand in this matter, it did him no good, for he died within 6 weeks, thinking it very hard and curious (at 80 years old) that he could not live to be Pope. This was the time when England had completed her loss of all her great French conquests. The people charged the loss principally upon the Earl of Suffolk, now a Duke, who had made those easy terms about the royal marriage, and who, they believed, had even been bought by France. So he was impeached as a traitor, on a great number of charges, but chiefly on accusations of having aided the French King, and of designing to make his own son King of England. The Commons and the people being violent against him, the King was made, by his friends, to interpose to save him, by banishing him for 5 years, and proroguing the Parliament. The Duke had much ado to escape from a London mob, 2,000 strong, who lay in wait for him in St. Giles's Fields, but he got down to his own estates in Suffolk, and sailed away from Ipswich. Sailing across the Channel, he sent into Calais to know if he might land there, but they kept his boat and men in the harbour, until an English ship, carrying 150 men, and called the Nicholas of the Tower, came alongside his little vessel, and ordered him on board. "Welcome, traitor, as men say," was the captain's grim and not very respectful salutation. He was kept on board a prisoner for 48 hours, and then a small boat appeared rowing toward the ship. As this boat came nearer, it was seen to have in it a block, a rusty sword, and an executioner in a black mask. The Duke was handed down into it, and there his head was cut off with 6 strokes of the rusty sword. Then the little boat rowed away to Dover Beach, where the body was cast out, and left until the Duchess claimed it. By whom, high in authority, this murder was committed, has never appeared. No one was ever punished for it. There now arose in Kent an Irishman, who gave himself the name of Mortimer, but whose real name was Jack Cade. Jack, in imitation of Wat Tyler, though he was a very different and inferior sort of man, addressed the Kentish men upon their wrongs, occasioned by the bad government of England, among so many battledores and such a poor shuttlecock, and the Kentish men rose up to the number of 20,000. Their place of assembly was Blackheath, where, headed by Jack, they put forth 2 papers, which they called the Complaint of the Commons of Kent, and the Requests of the Captain of the Great Assembly in Kent. They then retired to Sevenoaks. The royal army coming up with them here, they beat it and killed their general. Then Jack dressed himself in the dead general's armour, and led his men to London. Jack passed into the city from Southwark, over the bridge, and entered it in triumph, giving the strictest order to his men not to plunder. Having made a show of his forces there, while the citizens looked on quietly, he went back into Southwark in good order, and passed the night. Next day he came back again, having got hold in the meantime of Lord Say, an unpopular nobleman. Says Jack to the Lord Mayor and judges, "Will you be so good as to make a tribunal in Guildhall, and try me this nobleman?" The court being hastily made, he was found guilty, and Jack and his men cut his head off on Cornhill. They also cut off the head of his son-in-law, and then went back in good order to Southwark again. But, although the citizens could bear the beheading of an unpopular lord, they could not bear to have their houses pillaged; and it did so happen that Jack, after dinner, perhaps he had drunk a little too much, began to plunder the house where he lodged, upon which, of course, his men began to imitate him. Wherefore, the Londoners took counsel with Lord Scales, who had 1,000 soldiers in the Tower, and defended London Bridge, and kept Jack and his people out. This advantage gained, it was resolved by divers great men to divide Jack's army in the old way, by making a great many promises on behalf of the state that were never intended to be performed. This did divide them. Some of Jack's men saying that they ought to take the conditions which were offered, and others saying that they ought not, for they were only a snare; some going home at once, others staying where they were, and all doubting and quarrelling among themselves. Jack, who was in two minds about fighting or accepting a pardon, and who indeed did both, saw at last that there was nothing to expect from his men, and that it was very likely some of them would deliver him up and get a reward for 1,000 marks, which was offered for his apprehension. And so, after they had travelled and quarrelled all the way from Southwark to Blackheath, and from Blackheath to Rochester, he mounted a good horse and galloped away into Sussex. But there galloped after him, on a better horse, one Alexander Iden, who came up with him, had a hard fight with him, and killed him. Jack's head was set aloft on London Bridge, with a face looking toward Blackheath, where he had raised his flag, and Alexander Iden got the 1,000 marks. It is supposed by some that the Duke of York, who had been removed from a high post abroad through the Queen's influence, and sent out of the way to govern Ireland, was at the bottom of this rising of Jack and his men, because he wanted to trouble the government. He claimed, though not yet publicly, to have a better right to the throne than Henry of Lancaster, as one of the family of the Earl of March, whom Henry the Fourth had set aside. Touching this claim, which, being through female relationship, was not according to the usual descent, it is enough to say that Henry the Fourth was the free choice of the people and the Parliament, and that his family had now reigned undisputed for 60 years. The memory of Henry the Fifth was so famous, and the English people loved it so much, that the Duke of York's claim would, perhaps, never have been thought of, it would have been so hopeless, but for the unfortunate circumstance of the present King's being by this time quite an idiot, and the country very ill governed. These two circumstances gave the Duke of York a power he could not otherwise have had. Whether the Duke knew anything of Jack Cade or not, he came over from Ireland while Jack's head was on London Bridge, being secretly advised that the Queen was setting up his enemy, the Duke of Somerset, against him. He went to Westminster at the head of 4,000 men, and on his knees before the King, represented to him the bad state of the country, and petitioned him to summon a Parliament to consider it. This the King promised. When the Parliament was summoned, the Duke of York accused the Duke of Somerset, and the Duke of Somerset accused the Duke of York, and, both in and out of the Parliament, the followers of each party were full of violence and hatreds towards the other. At length the Duke of York put himself at the head of a large force of his tenants, and, in arms, demanded the reformation of the government. Being shut out of London, he encamped at Dartford, and the royal army encamped at Blackheath. According as either side triumphed, the Duke of York was arrested, or the Duke of Somerset was arrested. The trouble ended, for the moment, in the Duke of York renewing his oath of allegiance, and going in peace to one of his own castles. Half a year afterwards the Queen gave birth to a son, who was very ill received by the people, and not believed to be the son of the King. It shows the Duke of York to have been a moderate man, unwilling to involve England in new troubles, that he did not take advantage of the general discontent at this time, but really acted for the public good. He was made a member of the Cabinet, and the King being now so much worse that he could not be carried about and shown to the people with any decency, the Duke was made Lord Protector of the kingdom, until the King should recover, or the Prince should come of age. At the same time, the Duke of Somerset was committed to the Tower. So now the Duke of Somerset was down, and the Duke of York was up. By the end of the year, however, the King recovered his memory and some spark of sense, upon which the Queen used her power, which recovered with him, to get the Protector disgraced, and her favourite released. So now the Duke of York was down, and the Duke of Somerset was up. These ducal ups and downs gradually separated the whole nation into the two parties of York and Lancaster, and led to those terrible civil wars long known as the Wars of the Red and White Roses, because the red rose was the badge of the House of Lancaster, and the white rose was the badge of the House of York. The Duke of York, joined by some other powerful noblemen of the White Rose party, and leading a small army, met the King with another small army at St. Albans, and demanded that the Duke of Somerset should be given up. The poor King, being made to say in answer that he would sooner die, was instantly attacked. The Duke of Somerset was killed, and the King himself was wounded in the neck, and took refuge in the house of a poor tanner. Whereupon the Duke of York went to him, led him with great submission to the Abbey, and said he was very sorry for what had happened. Having now the King in his possession, he got a Parliament summoned, and himself once more made Protector, but only for a few months, for, on the King getting a little better again, the Queen and her party got him into their possession, and disgraced the Duke once more, so now the Duke of York was down again.
Some of the best men in power, seeing the danger of these constant changes, tried even then to prevent the Red and the White Rose wars. They brought about a great council in London between the two parties. The White Roses assembled in Blackfriars, the Red Roses in Whitefriars, and some good priests communicated between them, and made the proceedings known at evening to the King and the judges. They ended in a peaceful agreement that there should be no more quarrelling, and there was a great royal procession to St. Paul's, in which the Queen walked arm in arm with her old enemy, the Duke of York, to show the people how comfortable they all were. This state of peace lasted half a year, when a dispute between the Earl of Warwick, one of the Duke's powerful friends, and some of the King's servants at court, led to an attack upon that Earl, who was a White Rose, and to a sudden breaking out of all old animosities. So here were greater ups and downs than ever. There were even greater ups and downs than these soon after. After various battles, the Duke of York fled to Ireland, and his son the Earl of March to Calais, with their friends the Earl of Salisbury and Warwick, and a Parliament was held declaring them all traitors. Little the worse for this, the Earl of Warwick presently came back, landed in Kent, and was joined by the Archbishop of Canterbury and other powerful noblemen and gentlemen, engaged the King's forces at Northampton, signally defeated them, and took the King himself prisoner, who was found in his tent. Warwick would have been glad, I dare say, to have taken the Queen and Prince too, but they escaped into Wales and thence into Scotland. The King was carried by the victorious force straight to London, and made to call a new Parliament, which immediately declared that the Duke of York and those other noblemen were not traitors, but excellent subjects. Then, back comes the Duke from Ireland at the head of 500 horsemen, rides from London to Westminster, and enters the House of Lords. There, he laid his hand upon the cloth of gold which covered the empty throne, as if he had half a mind to sit down in it, but he did not. On the Archbishop of Canterbury asking him if he would visit the King, who was in his palace close by, he replied, "I know no one in this country, my lord, who ought not to visit me." None of the lords present spoke a single word, so the Duke went out as he had come in, established himself royally in the King's palace, and 6 days afterwards sent in to the lords a formal statement of his claim to the throne. The lords went to the King on this momentous subject, and after a great deal of discussion, in which the judges and the other law officers were afraid to give an opinion on either side, the question was compromised. It was agreed that the present King should retain the crown for his life, and that it should then pass to the Duke of York and his heirs. But the resolute Queen, determined on asserting her son's right, would hear of no such thing. She came from Scotland to the north of England, where several powerful lords armed in her cause. The Duke of York, for his part, set off with some 5,000 men, a little time before Christmas Day, 1460, to give her battle. He lodged at Sandal Castle near Wakefield, and the Red Roses defied him to come out on Wakefield Green and fight them then and there. His generals said he had best wait until his gallant son, the Earl of March, came up with his power, but he was determined to accept the challenge. He did so in an evil hour. He was hotly pressed on all sides, 2,000 of his men lay dead on Wakefield Green, and he himself was taken prisoner. They set him down in mock state on an ant-hill, and twisted grass about his head, and pretended to pay court to him on their knees, saying, "O King without a kingdom, and Prince without a people, we hope your gracious Majesty is very well and happy."
They did worse than this. They cut his head off, and handed it on a pole to the Queen, who laughed with delight when she saw it. You recollect their walking so religiously and comfortably to St. Paul's? And had it fixed, with a paper crown upon its head, on the walls of York. The Earl of Salisbury lost his head too, and the Duke of York's second son, a handsome boy who was flying with his tutor over Wakefield Bridge, was stabbed in the heart by a murderous lord, Lord Clifford by name, whose father had been killed by the White Roses in the fight at St. Albans. There was awful sacrifice of life in this battle, for no quarter was given, and the Queen was wild for revenge. When men unnaturally fight against their own countrymen, they are always observed to be more unnaturally cruel and filled with rage than they are against any other enemy. But Lord Clifford had stabbed the second son of the Duke of York, not the first. The eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, was at Gloucester, and, vowing vengeance for the death of his father, his brother, and their faithful friends, he began to march against the Queen. He had to turn and fight a great body of Welsh and Irish first, who worried his advance. These he defeated in a great fight at Mortimer's Cross, near Hereford, where he beheaded a number of the White Roses taken in battle, in retaliation for the beheading of the White Roses at Wakefield. The Queen had the next turn of beheading. Having moved toward London, and falling in, between St. Albans and Barnet, with the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Norfolk, White Roses both, who were there with an army to oppose her, and had got the King with them, she defeated them with great loss, and struck off the heads of 2 prisoners of note, who were in the King's tent with him, and to whom the King had promised his protection. Her triumph, however, was very short. She had no treasure, and her army persisted by plunder. This caused them to be hated and dreaded by the people, and particularly by the London people who were wealthy. As soon as the Londoners heard that Edward, Earl of March, united with the Earl of Warwick, was advancing toward the city, they refused to send the Queen supplies, and made a great rejoicing. The Queen and her men retreated with all speed, and Edward and Warwick came on, greeted with loud acclamations on every side. The courage, beauty, and virtues of young Edward could not be sufficiently praised by the whole people. He rode into London like a conqueror, and met with an enthusiastic welcome. A few days afterwards, Lord Falconbridge and the Bishop of Exeter assembled the citizens in St. John's Field, Clerkenwell, and asked them if they would have Henry of Lancaster for their king. To this they all roared, "No, no, no!" and "King Edward! King Edward!" Then said those noblemen, would they love and serve young Edward? To this they all cried, "Yes, yes!" and threw up their caps, and clapped their hands, and cheered tremendously. Therefore, it was declared that by joining the Queen and not protecting those 2 prisoners of note, Henry of Lancaster had forfeited the crown, and Edward of York was proclaimed King. He made a great speech to the applauding people at Westminster, and sat down as sovereign of England on that throne, on the golden covering of which his father, worthy of a better fate than the bloody axe which cut the thread of so many lives in England through so many years, had laid his hand. End of Chapter 22. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois. Chapter 23 of A Child's History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. A Child's History of England, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 23. England under Edward IV. King Edward IV was not quite 21 years of age when he took that unquiet seat upon the throne of England. The Lancaster party, the Red Roses, were then assembling in great numbers near York, and it was necessary to give them battle instantly. But the stout Earl of Warwick leading for the young King, and the young King himself closely following him, and the English people crowding round the royal standard, the White and the Red Roses met, on a wild March day when the snow was falling heavily, at Towton. and there such a furious battle raged between them that the total loss amounted to 40,000 men, all Englishmen, fighting, upon English ground, against one another. The young King gained the day, took down the heads of his father and brother from the walls of York, and put up the heads of some of the most famous noblemen engaged in the battle on the other side. Then he went to London, and was crowned with great splendour. A new Parliament met. No fewer than 150 of the principal noblemen and gentlemen on the Lancaster side were declared traitors, and the King, who had very little humanity, though he was handsome in person and agreeable in manners, resolved to do all he could to pluck up the red rose, root and branch. Queen Margaret, however, was still active for her young son. She obtained help from Scotland and from Normandy, and took several important English castles. But Warwick soon retook them. The Queen lost all her treasure on board ship in a great storm, and both she and her son suffered great misfortunes. Once, in the winter weather, as they were riding through a forest, they were attacked and plundered by a party of robbers, and when they had escaped from these men, and were passing alone and on foot through a thick dark part of the wood, they came, all at once, upon another robber. So the Queen, with a stout heart, took the little Prince by the hand, and, going straight up to that robber, said to him, "My friend, this is the young son of your lawful King. I confide him to your care." The robber was surprised, but took the boy in his arms, and faithfully restored him and his mother to their friends. In the end, the Queen's soldiers being beaten and dispersed, she went abroad again, and kept quiet for the present. Now, all this time, the deposed King Henry was concealed by a Welsh knight, who kept him close in his castle. But next year, the Lancaster party, recovering their spirits, raised a large body of men, and called him out of his retirement, to put him at their head. They were joined by some powerful noblemen, who had sworn fidelity to the new King, but who were ready, as usual, to break their oaths whenever they thought there was anything to be got by it. One of the worst things in the history of the War of the Red and White Roses is the ease with which these noblemen, who should have set an example of honour to the people, left either side as they took slight offence or were disappointed in their greedy expectations, and joined the other. Well, Warwick's brother soon beat the Lancastrians, and the false noblemen, being taken, were beheaded without a moment's loss of time. The deposed King had a narrow escape. 3 of his servants were taken, and one of them bore his cap of estate, which was set with pearls and embroidered with 2 golden crowns. However, the head, to which the cap belonged, got safely into Lancashire, and lay pretty quietly there, the people in the secret being very true, for more than a year. At length, an old monk gave such intelligence as led to Henry's being taken while he was sitting at dinner in a place called Waddington Hall. He was immediately sent to London, and met at Islington by the Earl of Warwick, by whose directions he was put upon a horse, with his legs tied under it, and paraded 3 times round the pillory. Then he was carried off to the Tower, where they treated him well enough. The White Rose being so triumphant, the young King abandoned himself entirely to pleasure, and led a jovial life. But thorns were springing up under his bed of roses, as he soon found out. For, having been privately married to Elizabeth Woodville, a young widow lady, very beautiful and very captivating, and at last resolving to make his secret known, and to declare her his queen, he gave some offence to the Earl of Warwick, who was usually called the King Maker, because of his power and influence, and because of his having lent such great help to placing Edward on the throne. This offence was not lessened by the jealousy with which the Neville family, the Earl of Warwick's, regarded the promotion of the Woodville family; for the young Queen was so bent on providing for her relations, that she made her father an Earl, and a great officer of state, married her 5 sisters to young noblemen of the highest rank, and provided for her younger brother, a young man of 20, by marrying him to an immensely rich old Duchess of 80. The Earl of Warwick took all this pretty graciously for a man of his proud temper, until the question arose to whom the King's sister, Margaret, should be married. The Earl of Warwick said, to one of the French King's sons, and was allowed to go over to the French King to make friendly proposals for that purpose, and to hold all manner of friendly interviews with him. But while he was so engaged, the Woodville party married the young lady to the Duke of Burgundy. Upon this he came back in great rage and scorn, and shut himself up discontented in his castle of Middleham. A reconciliation, though not a very sincere one, was patched up between the Earl of Warwick and the King, and lasted until the Earl married his daughter, against the King's wishes, to the Duke of Clarence. While the marriage was being celebrated at Calais, the people in the north of England, where the influence of the Neville family was strongest, broke out into rebellion. Their complaint was, that England was oppressed and plundered by the Woodville family, whom they demanded to have removed from power. As they were joined by great numbers of people, and as they openly declared that they were supported by the Earl of Warwick, the King did not know what to do. At last, as he wrote to the Earl beseeching his aid, he and his new son-in-law came over to England, and began to arrange the business by shutting the King up in Middleham Castle in the safe keeping of the Archbishop of York. So, England was not only in the strange position of having two kings at once, but they were both prisoners at the same time. Even as yet, however, the King-Maker was so far true to the King, that he dispersed a new rising of the Lancastrians, took their leader prisoner, and brought him to the King, who ordered him to be immediately executed. He presently allowed the King to return to London, and there innumerable pledges of forgiveness and friendship were exchanged between them, and between the Nevilles and the Woodvilles. The King's eldest daughter was promised in marriage to the heir of the Neville family, and more friendly oaths were sworn, and more friendly promises made, than this book would hold. They lasted about 3 months. At the end of that time, the Archbishop of York made a feast for the King, the Earl of Warwick, and the Duke of Clarence, at his house, the Moor, in Hertfordshire. The King was washing his hands before supper, when someone whispered him that a body of 100 men were lying in ambush outside the house. Whether this were true or untrue, the King took fright, mounted his horse, and rode through the dark night to Windsor Castle. Another reconciliation was patched up between him and the King-Maker, but it was a short one, and it was the last. A new rising took place in Lincolnshire, and the King marched to repress it. Having done so, he proclaimed that both the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Clarence were traitors, who had secretly assisted it, and who had been prepared publicly to join it on the following day. In these dangerous circumstances they both took ship, and sailed away to the French court. And here a meeting took place between the Earl of Warwick and his old enemy, the Dowager Queen Margaret, through whom his father had had his head struck off, and to whom he had been a bitter foe. But now, when he said that he had done with the ungrateful and perfidious Edward of York, and that henceforth he devoted himself to the restoration of the house of Lancaster, either in the person of her husband or of her little son, she embraced him as if he had ever been her dearest friend. She did more than that. She married her son to his second daughter, the Lady Anne. However agreeable this marriage was to the new friends, it was very disagreeable to the Duke of Clarence, who perceived that his father-in-law, the King-Maker, would never make him king now. So, being but a weak-minded young traitor, possessed of very little worth or sense, he readily listened to an artful court lady sent over for the purpose, and promised to turn traitor once more, and go over to his brother, King Edward, when a fitting opportunity should come. The Earl of Warwick, knowing nothing of this, soon redeemed his promise to the Dowager Queen Margaret by invading England and landing at Plymouth, where he instantly proclaimed King Henry, and summoned all Englishmen between the ages of 16 and 60 to join his banner. Then, with his army increasing as he marched along, he went northward, and came so near King Edward, who was in that part of the country, that Edward had to ride hard for it to the coast of Norfolk, and thence to get away in such ships as he could find, to Holland. Thereupon, the triumphant King Maker and his false son-in-law, the Duke of Clarence, went to London, took the old King out of the Tower, and walked him in a great procession to St. Paul's Cathedral with the crown upon his head. This did not improve the temper of the Duke of Clarence, who saw himself farther off from being king than ever; but he kept his secret, and said nothing. The Neville family were restored to all their honours and glories, and the Woodvilles and the rest were disgraced. The King Maker, less sanguinary than the King, shed no blood except that of the Earl of Worcester, who had been so cruel to the people as to have gained the title of the Butcher. Him they caught hidden in a tree, and him they tried and executed. No other death stained the King Maker's triumph. To dispute this triumph, back came King Edward again, next year, landing at Ravenspur, coming on to York, causing all his men to cry, "Long live King Henry!" and swearing on the altar, without a blush, that he came to lay no claim to the crown. Now was the time for the Duke of Clarence, who ordered his men to assume the white rose and declare for his brother. The Marquis of Montague, though the Earl of Warwick's brother, also declining to fight against King Edward, he went on successfully to London, where the Archbishop of York let him into the city, and where the people made great demonstrations in his favour. For this they had 4 reasons. Firstly, there were great numbers of the King's adherents hiding in the city and ready to break out. Secondly, the King owed them a great deal of money, which they could never hope to get if he were unsuccessful. Thirdly, there was a young prince to inherit the crown; and, fourthly, the King was gay and handsome, and more popular than a better man might have been with the city ladies. After a stay of only 2 days with these worthy supporters, the King marched out to Barnet Common, to give the Earl of Warwick battle. And now it was to be seen, for the last time, whether the King or the King Maker was to carry the day. While the battle was yet pending, the faint-hearted Duke of Clarence began to repent, and sent over secret messages to his father-in-law, offering his services in mediation with the King. But the Earl of Warwick disdainfully rejected them, and replied that Clarence was false and perjured, and that he would settle the quarrel by sword. The battle began at 4 o'clock in the morning, and lasted until 10, and during the greater part of the time it was fought in a thick mist, absurdly supposed to be raised by a magician. The loss of life was very great, for the hatred was strong on both sides. The King Maker was defeated, and the King triumphed. Both the Earl of Warwick and his brother were slain, and their bodies lay in St. Paul's, for some days, as a spectacle to the people. Margaret's spirit was not broken even by this great blow. Within 5 days she was in arms again, and raised her standard in Bath, whence she set off with her army to try and join Lord Pembroke, who had a force in Wales. But the King, coming up with her outside the town of Tewkesbury, and ordering his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, who was a brave soldier, to attack her men, she sustained an entire defeat, and was taken prisoner, together with her son, now only 18 years of age. The conduct of the King to this poor youth was worthy of his cruel character. He ordered him to be led into his tent. "And what," said he, "brought you to England?" "I came to England," replied the prisoner, with the spirit which a man of spirit might have admired in a captive, "to recover my father's kingdom, which descended to him as his right, and from him descends to me as mine." The King, drawing off his iron gauntlet, struck him with it in the face, and the Duke of Clarence and some other lords who were there, drew their noble swords, and killed him. His mother survived him, a prisoner, for 5 years. After her ransom by the King of France, she survived for 6 years more. Within 3 weeks of this murder, Henry died one of those convenient sudden deaths which were so common in the Tower. In plainer words, he was murdered by the King's order. Having no particular excitement on his hands after this great defeat of the Lancaster party, and being perhaps desirous to get rid of some of his fat, for he was now getting too corpulent to be handsome, the King thought of making war on France. As he wanted more money for this than the Parliament could give him, though they were usually ready enough for war, he invented a new way of raising it, by sending for the principal citizens of London, and telling them, with a grave face, that he was very much in want of cash, and would take it very kind in them if they would lend him some. It being impossible for them safely to refuse, they complied, and the moneys thus forced from them were called, no doubt to the great amusement of the King and the Court, as if they were free gifts, benevolences. What with grants from Parliament, and what with benevolences, the King raised an army and passed over to Calais. As nobody wanted war, however, the French King made proposals of peace, which were accepted, and a truce was concluded for 7 long years. The proceedings between the Kings of France and England on this occasion were very friendly, very splendid, and very distrustful. They finished with a meeting between the two Kings on a temporary bridge over the river Somme, where they embraced through 2 holes in a strong wooden grating, like a lion's cage, and made several bows and fine speeches to one another. It was time, now, that the Duke of Clarence should be punished for his treacheries, and fate had his punishment in store. He was, probably, not trusted by the King, for who could trust him who knew him? And he had certainly a powerful opponent in his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who, being avaricious and ambitious, wanted to marry that widowed daughter of the Earl of Warwick's who had been espoused to the deceased young prince at Calais. Clarence, who wanted all the family wealth for himself, secreted this lady, whom Richard found disguised as a servant in the City of London, and whom he married. Arbitrators appointed by the King then divided the property between the brothers. This led to ill will and mistrust between them. Clarence's wife dying, and he wishing to make another marriage, which was obnoxious to the King, his ruin was hurried by that means too. At first, the Court struck at his retainers and dependents, and accused some of them of magic and witchcraft, and similar nonsense. Successful against this small game, it then mounted to the Duke himself, who was impeached by his brother the King, in person, on a variety of such charges. He was found guilty, and sentenced to be publicly executed. He never was publicly executed, but he met his death somehow, in the Tower, and, no doubt, through some agency of the King or his brother Gloucester, or both. It was supposed at the time that he was told to choose the manner of his death, and that he chose to be drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. I hope the story may be true, for it would have been a becoming death for such a miserable creature. The King survived him some 5 years. He died in the 42nd year of his life, and the 23rd of his reign. He had a very good capacity and some good points, but he was selfish, careless, sensual, and cruel. He was a favourite with the people for his showy manners, and the people were a good example to him in the constancy of their attachment. He was penitent on his deathbed for his benevolences and other extortions, and ordered restitution to be made to the people who had suffered from them. He also called about his bed the enriched members of the Woodville family, and the proud lords whose honours were of older date, and endeavoured to reconcile them, for the sake of the peaceful succession of his son, and the tranquillity of England. End of chapter 23. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois.
Chapter 24 of A Child's History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. October 2007. A Child's History of England by Charles Dickens. Chapter 24. England under Edward the Fifth. The late King's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, called Edward after him, was only 13 years of age at his father's death. He was at Ludlow Castle with his uncle, the Earl of Rivers. The Prince's brother, the Duke of York, only 11 years of age, was in London with his mother. The boldest, most crafty, and most dreaded nobleman in England at that time was their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and everybody wondered how the two poor boys would fare with such an uncle for a friend or a foe. The Queen their mother, being exceedingly uneasy about this, was anxious that instructions should be sent to Lord Rivers to raise an army to escort the young King safely to London. But Lord Hastings, who was of the court party opposed to the Woodvilles, and who disliked the thought of giving them that power, argued against the proposal, and obliged the Queen to be satisfied with an escort of 2,000 horse. The Duke of Gloucester did nothing at first to justify suspicion. He came from Scotland, where he was commanding an army, to York, and was there the first to swear allegiance to his nephew. He then wrote a condoling letter to the Queen Mother, and set off to be present at the coronation in London. Now the young King, journeying towards London too, with Lord Rivers and Lord Grey, came to Stony Stratford, as his uncle came to Northampton, about 10 miles distant; and when those two lords heard that the Duke of Gloucester was so near, they proposed to the young King that they should go back and greet him in his name. The boy being very willing that they should do so, they rode off and were received with great friendliness, and asked by the Duke of Gloucester to stay and dine with him. In the evening, while they were merry together, up came the Duke of Buckingham with 300 horsemen, and next morning the two lords and the two dukes and the 300 horsemen rode away together to rejoin the King. Just as they were entering Stony Stratford, the Duke of Gloucester, checking his horse, suddenly turned on the two lords, charged them with alienating from him the affections of his sweet nephew, and caused them to be arrested by the 300 horsemen and taken back. Then he and the Duke of Buckingham went straight to the King, whom they had now in their power, to whom they made a show of kneeling down, and offering great love and submission; and then they ordered his attendants to disperse, and took him, alone with them, to Northampton. A few days afterwards they conducted him to London, and lodged him in the Bishop's palace. But he did not remain there long, for the Duke of Buckingham, with a tender face, made a speech expressing how anxious he was for the royal boy's safety, and how much safer he would be in the Tower until his coronation, than he could be anywhere else. So to the Tower he was taken, very carefully, and the Duke of Gloucester was named Protector of the State. Although Gloucester had proceeded thus far with a very smooth countenance, and although he was a clever man, fair of speech, and not ill-looking, in spite of one of his shoulders being something higher than the other, and although he had come into the city riding bare-headed at the King's side, and looking very fond of him, he had made the King's mother more uneasy yet, and when the royal boy was taken to the Tower, she became so alarmed that she took sanctuary in Westminster with her 5 daughters. Nor did she do this without reason, for the Duke of Gloucester, finding that the lords who were opposed to the Woodville family were faithful to the young King nevertheless, quickly resolved to strike a blow for himself. Accordingly, while those lords met in council at the Tower, he and those who were in his interest met in separate council at his own residence, Crosby Palace, in Bishopgate Street. Being at last quite prepared, he one day appeared unexpectedly at the council in the Tower, and appeared to be very jocular and merry. He was particularly gay with the Bishop of Ely, praising the strawberries that grew in his garden on Holborn Hill, and asking him to have some gathered that he might eat them at dinner. The Bishop, quite proud of the honour, sent one of his men to fetch some, and the Duke, still very jocular and gay, went out, and the council all said what a very agreeable Duke he was. In a little time, however, he came back quite altered, not at all jocular, frowning and fierce, and suddenly said, "What do those persons deserve who have compassed my destruction, I being the King's lawful as well as natural protector?" To this strange question Lord Hastings replied that they deserved death, whosoever they were. "Then," said the Duke, "I tell you that they are that sorceress my brother's wife," meaning the Queen, "and that other sorceress, Jane Shore." who by witchcraft have withered my body and caused my arm to shrink, as I now show you." He then pulled up his sleeve and showed them his arm, which was shrunken, it is true, but which had been so, as they all very well knew, from the hour of his birth. Jane Shore, being then the lover of Lord Hastings, as she had formerly been of the late King, that lord knew that he himself was attacked, so he said, in some confusion, "Certainly, my lord, if they have done this, they be worthy of punishment." "If?" said the Duke of Gloucester. "Do you talk to me of ifs? I tell you that they have so done, and I will make it good upon thy body, thou traitor!" With that he struck the table a great blow with his fist. This was a signal to some of his people outside to cry, "Treason!" They immediately did so, and there was a rush into the chamber of so many armed men that it was filled in a moment. "First," said the Duke of Gloucester to Lord Hastings, "I arrest thee, traitor, and let him," he added to the armed men who took him, "have a priest at once, for by St. Paul I will not dine until I have seen his head off." Lord Hastings was hurried to the green by the Tower Chapel, and there beheaded, on a log of wood that happened to be lying on the ground. Then the Duke dined with a good appetite, and after dinner summoning the principal citizens to attend him, told them that Lord Hastings and the rest had designed to murder both himself and the Duke of Buckingham, who stood by his side, if he had not providentially discovered their design. He requested them to be so obliging as to inform their fellow citizens of the truth of what he said, and issued a proclamation, prepared and neatly copied out beforehand, to the same effect. On the same day that the Duke did these things in the Tower, Sir Richard Ratcliffe, the boldest and most undaunted of his men, went down to Pontefract, arrested Lord Rivers, Lord Grey, and 2 other gentlemen, and publicly executed them on the scaffold, without any trial, for having intended the Duke's death. 3 days afterwards the Duke, not to lose time, went down the river to Westminster in his barge, attended by divers bishops, lords, and soldiers, and demanded that the Queen should deliver her second son, the Duke of York, into his safe keeping. The Queen, being obliged to comply, resigned the child after she had wept over him, and Richard of Gloucester placed him with his brother in the Tower. Then he seized Jane Shore, and because she had been the lover of the late King, confiscated her property, and got her sentenced to do public penance in the streets by walking in a scanty dress, with bare feet, and carrying a lighted candle to St. Paul's Cathedral, through the most crowded part of the city. Having now all things ready for his own advancement, he caused a friar to preach a sermon at the cross which stood in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, in which he dwelt upon the profligate manners of the late King, and upon the late shame of Jane Shore, and hinted that the princes were not his children. "Whereas, good people," said the friar, whose name was Shaw, "my Lord the Protector, the noble Duke of Gloucester, that sweet prince, the pattern of all the noblest virtues, is the perfect image and express likeness of his father." There had been a little plot between the Duke and the friar, that the Duke should appear in the crowd at this moment, when it was expected that the people would cry, "Long live King Richard!" But, either through the friar saying the words too soon, or through the Duke's coming too late, the Duke and the words did not come together, and the people only laughed, and the friar sneaked off ashamed. The Duke of Buckingham was a better hand at such business than the friar, so he went to the Guildhall the next day, and addressed the citizens in the Lord Protector's behalf. A few dirty men who had been hired and stationed there for the purpose, crying when he had done, "God save King Richard!" he made them a great bow, and thanked them with all his heart. Next day, to make an end of it, he went with the mayor and some lords and citizens to Bayard Castle by the river, where Richard then was, and read an address, humbly entreating him to accept the crown of England. Richard, who looked down upon them out of a window, and pretended to be in great uneasiness and alarm, assured them there was nothing he desired less, and that his deep affection for his nephews forbade him to think of it. To this the Duke of Buckingham replied, with pretended warmth, that the free people of England would never submit to his nephew's rule, and that if Richard, who was the lawful heir, refused the crown, why then they must find some one else to wear it. The Duke of Gloucester returned, that, since he used that strong language, it became his painful duty to think no more of himself, and to accept the crown. Upon that, the people cheered and dispersed, and the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Buckingham passed a pleasant evening, talking over the play they had just acted with so much success, and every word of which they had prepared together. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of A Child's History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. July 2007. A Child's History of England by Charles Dickens. Chapter 25. England under Richard III. King Richard III was up betimes in the morning, and went to Westminster Hall. In the hall was a marble seat, upon which he sat himself down between two great noblemen, and told the people that he began the new reign in that place, because the first duty of a sovereign was to administer the laws equally to all, and to maintain justice. He then mounted his horse and rode back to the city, where he was received by the clergy and the crowd as if he really had a right to the throne, and really were a just man. The clergy and the crowd must have been rather ashamed of themselves in secret, I think, for being such poor spirited knaves. The new king and his queen were soon crowned with a great deal of show and noise, which the people liked very much, and then the king set forth on a royal progress through his dominions. He was crowned a second time at York, in order that the people might have show and noise enough, and wherever he went he was received with shouts of rejoicing from a good many people of strong lungs, who were paid to strain their throats in crying, "God save King Richard." The plan was so successful that I am told it has been imitated since, by other usurpers in other progresses through other dominions. While he was on this journey, King Richard stayed a week at Warwick, and from Warwick he sent instructions home for one of the wickedest murders that ever was done, the murder of the two young princes, his nephews, who were shut up in the Tower of London. Sir Robert Brackenbury was at that time governor of the Tower. To him, by the hands of a messenger named John Green, did King Richard send a letter, ordering him by some means to put the two young princes to death. But Sir Robert, I hope because he had children of his own, and loved them, sent John Green back again, riding and spurring along the dusty roads, with the answer that he could not do so horrible a piece of work. The King, having frowningly considered a little, called to him Sir James Tyrrel, his master of the horse, and to him gave authority to take command of the Tower whenever he would, for 24 hours, and to keep all the keys of the Tower during that space of time. Tyrrel, well knowing what was wanted, looked about him for two hardened ruffians, and chose John Dighton, one of his own grooms, and Miles Forest, who was a murderer by trade. Having secured these two assistants, he went, upon a day in August, to the Tower, showed his authority from the King, took the command for 24 hours, and obtained possession of the keys. And when the black night came he went creeping, like a guilty villain as he was, up the dark, stone-winding stairs, and along the dark stone passages, until he came to the door of the room where the two young princes, having said their prayers, lay fast asleep, clasped in each other's arms. And while he watched and listened at the door, he sent in those evil demons, John Dighton and Miles Forest, who smothered the two princes with the bed and pillows, and carried their bodies down the stairs and buried them under a great heap of stones at the staircase foot. And when the day came, he gave up the command of the Tower and restored the keys, and hurried away without once looking behind him, and Sir Robert Brackenbury went with fear and sadness to the prince's room, and found the princes gone for ever. You know, through all this history, how true it is that traitors are never true, and you will not be surprised to learn that the Duke of Buckingham soon turned against King Richard, and joined a great conspiracy that was formed to dethrone him, and to place the crown upon its rightful owner's head. Richard had meant to keep the murder secret, but when he heard through his spies that this conspiracy existed, and that many lords and gentlemen drank in secret to the healths of the two young princes in the Tower, he made it known that they were dead. The conspirators, though thwarted for a moment, soon resolved to set up for the crown against the murderous Richard, Henry, Earl of Richmond, grandson of Catherine, that widow of Henry V who married Owen Tudor. And as Henry was of the house of Lancaster, they proposed that he should marry the Princess Elizabeth, the eldest daughter of the late King, now the heiress of the house of York, and thus, by uniting the rival families, put an end to the fatal wars of the Red and White Roses. All being settled, a time was appointed for Henry to come over from Brittany, and for a great rising against Richard to take place in several parts of England at the same hour. On a certain day, therefore, in October, the revolt took place, but unsuccessfully. Richard was prepared. Henry was driven back at sea by a storm. His followers in England were dispersed, and the Duke of Buckingham was taken, and at once beheaded in the market-place at Salisbury. The time of his success was a good time, Richard thought, for summoning a Parliament and getting some money. So a Parliament was called, and it flattered and fawned upon him as much as he could possibly desire, and declared him to be the rightful King of England, and his only son Edward, then 11 years of age, the next heir to the throne. Richard knew full well that, let the Parliament say what it would, the Princess Elizabeth was remembered by people as the heiress of the house of York, and having accurate information besides of its being designed by the conspirators to marry her to Henry of Richmond, he felt that it would much strengthen him and weaken them to be beforehand with them and marry her to his son. With this view he went to the sanctuary at Westminster, where the late King's widow and her daughter still were, and besought them to come to court, where, he swore by anything and everything, they should be safely and honourably entertained. They came accordingly, but had scarcely been at court a month when his son died suddenly, or was poisoned, and his plan was crushed to pieces. In this extremity, King Richard, always active, thought, "I must make another plan." And he made the plan of marrying the Princess Elizabeth himself, although she was his niece. There was one difficulty in the way. His wife, the Queen Anne, was alive. But he knew, remembering his nephews, how to remove that obstacle, and he made love to the Princess Elizabeth, telling her he felt perfectly confident that the Queen would die in February. The Princess was not a very scrupulous young lady, for, instead of rejecting the murderer of her brothers with scorn and hatred, she openly declared she loved him dearly. And, when February came and the Queen did not die, she expressed her impatient opinion that she was too long about it. However, King Richard was not so far out in his prediction, but that she died in March, he took good care of that, and then this precious pair hoped to be married. But they were disappointed, for the idea of such a marriage was so unpopular in the country that the King's chief counsellors, Ratcliffe and Catesby, would by no means undertake to propose it, and the King was even obliged to declare in public that he had never thought of such a thing. He was, by this time, dreaded and hated by all classes of his subjects. His nobles deserted every day to Henry's side. He dared not call another Parliament, lest his crimes should be denounced there; and for want of money he was obliged to get benevolences from the citizens, which exasperated them all against him. It was said, too, that being stricken by his conscience, he dreamed frightful dreams, and started up in the night time, wild with terror and remorse. Active to the last through all this, he issued vigorous proclamations against Henry of Richmond and all his followers when he heard that they were coming against him with a fleet from France, and took the field as fierce and savage as a wild boar, the animal represented on his shield. Henry of Richmond landed with 6,000 men at Milford Haven, and came on against King Richard, then encamped at Leicester with an army twice as great, through North Wales. On Bosworth Field the two armies met, and Richard, looking along Henry's ranks, and seeing them crowded with the English nobles who had abandoned him, turned pale when he beheld the powerful Lord Stanley and his son, whom he had tried hard to retain, among them. But he was as brave as he was wicked, and plunged into the thickest of the fight. He was riding hither and thither, laying about him in all directions, when he observed the Earl of Northumberland, one of his few great allies, to stand inactive, and the main body of his troops to hesitate. At the same moment his desperate glance caught Henry of Richmond among a little group of his knights. Riding hard at him, and crying "Treason!" he killed his standard-bearer, fiercely unhorsed another gentleman, and aimed a powerful stroke at Henry himself, to cut him down. But Sir William Stanley parried it as it fell, and before Richard could raise his arm again, he was borne down in a press of numbers, unhorsed, and killed. Lord Stanley picked up the crown, all bruised and trampled and stained with blood, and put it upon Richmond's head, amid loud and rejoicing cries of "Long live King Henry!" That night a horse was led up to the church of the Grey Friars at Leicester, across whose back was tied, like some worthless sack, a naked body brought there for burial. It was the body of the last of the Plantagenet line, King Richard the Third, usurper and murderer, slain at the battle of Bosworth Field, in the 32nd year of his age, after a reign of 2 years. End of chapter 25.